So this podcast is very much about entrepreneurs, artists, creatives, serial creators. Uh,
Mhm.
what makes them tick? What's the mindset, the mental health, the story behind the minds. And that's
Mhm.
what you and I are going to get into today. Like, yes, we'll
Sure.
talk about historical stuff and what you're working on, but like what makes you tick.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I've looked at a couple of your podcasts, and I can see that there's a theme there in terms of uh, trying to discover, the commonalities behind the creative juice that keeps people excited.
yeah, absolutely. Which is kind of funny because, since we're chatting and since we're just diving in, that sounds like how you were from a young age onward, like picking things up, taking them apart, trying to see how they tick.
Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I've always been a tinkerer, and I remember my parents. I'm one of 5 kids, and my dad worked for the federal government and, in Ottawa, and, we're a very musical family, and there's always a lot of music, but for me, the present that my family would buy me would be 5 rolls of masking tape. Because I would make things out of masking tape and cardboard and all these sorts of things, and the household supply of all the sort of things that I needed to build into the world somehow, uh, we're always drained, right? So
So I was going through your background as much as possible because there's lots of bullet points, and it was obvious that there was a lot of music. You even highlighted the fact that it was, a large supportive family, a musical family.
yeah.
What about the tinkering or the taking things apart first grabbed you?
I don't know, it feels like, the tinkering, the fascination with mechanisms, in the early days and, nowadays it has diversified into all kinds of non-mechanical things. Um, I think that comes from my dad. My dad, the family lore, and you know how it's easy for families to build a lore that maybe may not be true, but we like to grab onto the sorts of things that we like at any particular moment, as a way of canonizing somebody. Um, but apparently, he built a truck out of 2 Model Ts when he was at 12 or something, and he had kind of a mechanical aptitude. He like me. He was ambidextrous like I am, um, and he always loved the challenge of building something. And I think he encouraged me to explore, um, and he didn't help me. Like sometimes, literally, I would be in tears of frustration uh, with something usually to do with my assumptions about a specific materiality that wasn't working with me,
Uh-huh.
and so I remember building a birdhouse out of cedar, and it split like crazy. And cedar's like that, but you have to discover cedars like that to know that either you have to deal with it this way or you don't use cedar for this type of work. And
Yeah.
but he would just like leave me to like stew in my juices of frustration and figure it out. And on occasion he would say, well, maybe what you might want to do is right. And but I think that for me, a lot of the skills that I gained were just because of this dogged determination to just keep at it until something materializes. And I realized that often the thing that I had initially thought I wanted to materialize would actually come around in the interaction with the world to become something else that I actually preferred. uh, that serendipitous chance and all of the things that are a combination of the materiality, its tendencies, the predilection of the materials, my skills at the level that they're at, the tools, how sharp they are, how all these sorts of things. Every single thing leads to a multidimensional learning experience
Mm,
that at the end you learn how to hold a plane.
yeah,
You can't hold it this way, can you? You learn how to set the blade the hard way, which is by myriads of mistakes,
yeah.
right? And
You
I think that somehow my dad knew that, and he wasn't gonna hand me anything on a silver platter, and I think maybe that was his tradition with my grandfather. Um, Figure it out for yourself. That way you'll really have a skill that you understand in all its dimensions. I mean, you can go on to, and I do this all the time. I'll go on to YouTube and I'll see how someone else is doing something so that I can think, oh, in terms of an inventory of possibilities, this seems like a really good idea, but it doesn't give me any like tactile or palpable skills about how to do that.
yeah.
It's easy to
You
watch welding videos, but actually make that little curl with the end of the welding, as it's feeding, and get it right so the heat's just right and the bead looks nice and there's penetration, and you're not like burning your hands. There's so many possibilities that have to be experienced, right? So I don't know what your original question was, but
No, 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 that's great. So you actually you kind of answered my follow-up question, but you reminded me of, an experience I had in university. So before I started to develop websites, I got into computers, and it was the late 90s, early 2000s, and I was with a friend, George, who, I think I was in computer science. He said, "Computer science is a waste of time. I'll teach you everything. Find a new major." And
yeah.
sure enough, we took computers apart, and he showed me how to take the motherboard out and how the hard drive connected and the CPU and the heat sink and like all these different things. And then eventually, put them together, troubleshooting them, installing software. And there were so many times that I asked him, okay, what am I doing? Like, how, I don't want to mess this up. And I'll never forget him saying repeatedly, dude, Google it. And I don't think it was necessarily because he was lazy or didn't want to help me. I think in his own way, he was trying to teach me how to learn better. Just like the adage, right? You can fish for a man or show a man how to fish, but if you teach a man, he's going to be able to feed himself. It sounds like your dad almost had that same principle where he said, "Of course you're asking me, and of course I want to help, but I know that you're going to have a better outcome if you figure it out."
Yeah, I think I can assume that that's what was going on in his mind.
So did you do it with all the kids or just you?
Can't really speak for my older brother and sisters. Probably though. He was a pretty consistent person, right? So, um, probably, yeah. But I think that maybe my brother and I had the greatest degree of crossover of
Right.
interests with my dad. Um, and so we may have been the ones to uh, get the biggest benefit about that in the sort of almost like the pedagogy of breeding independence in his kids. And I think your friend saying Google it, he's just giving you independence from him, right?
Yeah.
Uh, so you can go home and fix your own computer without him, right?
Totally agree. And I think it's such an important thing. Like we with my company now have this philosophy where it's okay for one person to have that role. It's okay for one person to be the person that does that task, but it's equally important for all of us to have the knowledge base. So if someone is publishing the newsletter, that's okay. I don't have time to deal with that, but I should know what he or she is doing so that if something happens or if there is a change, I've already got that skill set, at least at a minimum amount so that I can jump in. So it's nice to know across multiple different areas what is happening, right? And that way you don't lose sight of your company or the art that you're creating.
Yeah, I think it's the same in crews of sailboats. Everybody should learn how to navigate everybody should like know the difference between a chart and a flawed GPS reading, and everybody needs how to know how to reef the sail. And you know, the maybe the captain uh uh knows how to do everything, but without a skilled crew, without a crew that doesn't screw up as soon as there's a moment of pressure, because that's the thing about
Yeah.
sailing. There's always everything happens wrong at the same moment.
Mhm.
And so if you can't like if you can't like put a rope down on the deck that's not going to tangle and you know hook you up the mast or something, that's a problem that you know will come back to haunt you in the next 3.5 minutes as the wind is starting to blow.
Yeah, absolutely. So looking at your childhood trajectory, it almost started with music, but then left music and went into electronics, and then left that, and there was the corporate world, and then went back into music. It's almost like a sound wave through your life. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
does that sound accurate?
I would say that's accurate. I think that the different phases of the wave, the negative and positive, have always been kind of parallel, but the tendency towards one or the other is really rooted in what I'm doing at that moment. And of course, there's this added temporality to it that you know as you go from like music down to technology, or maybe I should invert it because it seems like there's a hierarchy there. But as you go from one to the other, um, you tend to forget a little bit about the thing that was the previous, you know, opposite phase.
Yeah.
And so then when you come back to it, it's like there's a kind of a coalescence of all of the accumulated skills that were there before, and you it comes back quicker.
Mhm.
Um, but then, you know, there's other aspects which now there's those particular issues are gone. Like, so for example, there was a time when uh, I went out running and I tripped and I broke a little bone in my wrist. And, you know, it wasn't a terrible thing, but I'd stopped, I stopped playing the piano for, I don't know, just pronating would hurt it. So maybe for 6 months I stopped playing. And afterwards, it's like, oh yeah, I can play now. I can, you know, I can do stride playing or whatever I was doing, and it doesn't hurt, right? And
Mhm.
what I realized was that little switch from playing to not playing propelled my interests into something else, which was more to do with mechanics and it was at a time when it was ideal because there was a gig and a job and interesting things that were pointing not in, you know, into development of a product rather than into music or music performance or just the sheer enjoyment of it. So when I came back to the piano and started playing again, I realized that a certain kind of a tension in my arm that had manifested maybe because of pressure from teachers and pressures of performance or pressures of whatever had kind of been adding just a little extra dampening to my arm, and so that if I
Mhm.
wanted to move something, I wanted to move the line very quickly with my right hand, it would be like a little extra friction, like a little extra molasses in my muscles. Anyway, so didn't touch the piano for like 6 or 8 months, and then when it came back, it's like I play this line that's like, oh my god, I've never been able to play that before. And I realized that in that break, whatever it was that was being carried forward day to day as kind of a physiological tension
Mhm.
evaporated.
Wow.
And all of a sudden, I didn't have that tension in my arm anymore. I still don't have that tension, right? But how could anyone have known that, right? Without the you know uh, the strange serendipitous incursion of a broken whatever that little bone is. Uh,
It makes you wonder if, if it was physical because of the injury and then the way that it healed, or if it's simply that the time away allowed you to relax that part of your mind. Do you think
I
it's
think
more?
so. I think it's both. I think it's it's some kind of a relaxation in the neural pathways.
Okay.
Uh, and I think it's in the brain. I think it's a system.
Mm,
Everything is porous and interconnected, and maybe it may not matter, which thing we can pin the label, but I would say that what I can do is say, "Well, it's gone now," and
yeah.
like that seems like it seemed like a blessing at the time, and still does, because I might still be having that kind of that slowness in my playing that I didn't have, uh, or that I did have before. Yeah.
It's interesting that you use the word system because it sounds like you're very fascinated by systems. You might have started by taking things apart, but then there was this changeover in your life and career where it was compiling things, right? Like we can talk a bit more about your art and compiling physical with sound and whatnot, but did you have a switch over from destruction to creation almost?
Yeah, I think it happened early on. I started making all kinds of stuff, and I had a phase in my early teens where I was fascinated with speed, and I managed to survive it because it was crazy. I inherited a go kart frame from my brother, and immediately put two engines on it, like one for the right side and one for the left side. So you could jam the brakes on one side and hit the accelerator on the other and make it spin. And that thing was like crazy unstable.
Mm,
And I was into I had I had like a crappy motorcycle, and finally managed to turn that into a dirt bike, and then had like a dirt bike and then a bigger dirt bike, and you know got run over by other motorcycles, racing in the mud with other dirt bikes, and had a speedboat, which was like crazy fast. And, you know, it was actually the speedboat that finished it for me, because at one point it just, you can see like these hydroplanes that are going across the water. And
mhm.
it basically, it decided to fly with me
Oof.
driving it. Um, just luckily, most of the time what happens is when they take off, they flip around, and they go like that and land upside down the wrong way and push the driver backwards through the front of the boat. This one, it just it just kind of floated in the air for maybe seems like about a year to me, in my memory. But then it just landed, and the right side up, and I just like pulled the throttle back and literally went at like rowboat speed, the 2 miles back to the dock, and it's like, that's it. I'm never doing that shit again.
Wow.
And actually, that boat I sold, and I bought a Hammond L100 organ with the money from the boat.
So the
Uh,
need for speed resulted in I don't want to say something near death, but definitely like a life altering experience, which then propelled you into music.
well, yeah, I was already doing music as well. Just there's this kind of like this phasey thing that you're talking about, from one to the other, or maybe both simultaneously, and maybe just my remembrance of it
Mm,
is a episodal kind of thing. Um, but yeah, it's hard to know. But definitely, like after that point, I didn't like want to go fast, and I'm a very patient driver now. I I in Quebec at 120 kilometers an hour, maybe you might get a fine because there's a threshold that is crossed there.
mm.
So I drive at 119.
Play it safe.
I'm fine with that. And
Are
I've driven
you
at 119 past multiple police speed traps, and it hasn't been a problem. But I've seen guys that went whipping by me get stopped. So somewhere in there, maybe I can make it to 122 and still get away with it. I don't. So,
how
uh, anyway, to answer your question, there's always been this kind of entanglement of music and music technology and the music itself, and so it's kind of like there's a separation. But I also see the development of technologies that are related to music, or the expression of musical form into the
mm,
future, that you can't tell what that'll be. This is my particular thing that fascinates me. Um, are like a combination of the two, like the attitudes, the aptitudes that being a musician has ingrained in me are very germane to the decision making that I make, in the process of when something reveals itself that seems like a magical thing, right? So I'm always trying to find a surprise in the materials, a surprise
Yeah.
in behavior, and I follow that. I might not have known what it was I would be following before I get to it. But then when it's almost like if I were to generalize where my really good skills are, it's like it's recognizing that, hey, right there, that little insignificant something that just happened, there's like some kind of a magic in that, and I'm gonna like try to crack that open, right? And
Yeah.
find out what kind of irregularities, what kind of unpredictabilities, what um, kind of magical generative properties this particular thing that I just observed might have.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of the ways that you know, it's almost like my musical sensibility pervades in the kind of an editorial way. Um,
Yeah.
I say, well, yeah, I could go this way, but it's going to be engineering computer dweeb like, or if I go this way, it's going to be more like something that is existing in the real world at the same order of magnitude that we can experience. So then, rather than being abstract or two dimensional or built into some kind of a Cartesian box, it would engage like the human panoply of sensorium.
Uh-huh.
We've got so many senses, that we can combine them into these subtle ways that often technology just kind of drops in the headlong rush to achieve something specific, which often is market driven. Um,
Absolutely.
but not always. It could just be because that's what the person wanted to do, and they didn't notice that there's another thing here, which is probably better. I firmly believe that serendipity will always give me a better way of doing things than the thing that I'm trying to do. And I kind of just looking for surprise. Yeah, surprise me. And then, that's so that puts me into realms where I am surprised. And then when I am surprised, it's like, hey, here's something, right? I'm going to develop this. Whoa, who could have thought that?
Yeah.
Right. In fact,
So
often when I'm sorry, I do tend to talk a lot, so
that's
you can
okay.
interrupt me. You can interrupt me at any
Okay,
time.
I'll interrupt you. Let me interrupt you then. So,
Okay.
now that I have your permission, I'm going to do it more. So,
Hey, wait.
you, you said something fascinating there. So, you're an artist, audio engineer, composer, instrument builder. There's so many things going on. When you make decisions or when you plan out, a roadmap, do you tend to lean towards a plan or a strategy, or do you let it be happenstance? Like how have you had such a complex career of different things, different projects and artworks? How have you allowed that to
Yeah,
happen?
I mean, there's a crazy diversity, but I think that's because I let the project think me. Now that sounds crazy, but but I have kind of a it's a person is not a brain in a vat.
Yeah.
Right? Like the Star Trek episode where they 5,000 quadloos, you know? um, uh, so from my perspective, I do make a plan. I
Okay.
make a plan, and the plan is I'm going to pursue this particular idea until something better is suggested. And the better is suggested is part of the flexibility in my plan. Um,
Mm,
um, because without a plan, it's hard to remain motivated in the moment because a lot of the things that are done momentary, I'm doing metalworking, I'm doing woodworking, I'm building prototypes that I'm not even quite sure what they're for sometimes yet. I have a vague idea, but often it is like a proof of concept thing. It's like, this seems like a really great idea. Can it be possible to do this? And so my plan is, can it be possible? And then using all of the experience of the years of building things and combining electronics and um, physics and wood and metal and my own particular design chops, which tend to be kind of almost steampunk, I would say,
Yeah.
uh, would be kind of the aesthetic that, but maybe a little bit more austere than steampunk. Uh, like, and like, I don't plan to make it steampunk, and I don't plan to make it more austere than steampunk. But when I look at the works, I can see a kind of consanguinity between them, which I realize comes from, my own drawing board per se.
Yeah. So
Um,
you have a skill set and a knowledge base and a plan and an idea, and you go down that path, but then you're also aware enough to know that that'll probably see a lot of change along the way. And so if you're open to the change, that ultimately you'll end up where you're supposed to be.
yeah, or just start a new project. Um, because sometimes the idea behind a project might seem really exciting, and then I might exhaust myself trying to find a specific type of magic that will never ever be reproduced.
Mhm.
Um, and that failure to be able to reproduce it is because I haven't s- figured out what the conditions were that created that thing in the first place. And I have an example of a failure for you if you'd be
Yeah,
interested.
go for it. Definitely.
Okay, so I had this like a small boutique 5.1 mixing studio in Toronto for many decades, and it kind of started out of me building custom bits of gear and throwing it together, and all of a sudden we had clients, and we just kind of muddled on through. There was never intention to have a recording studio and bring it. It just kind of happened, like two friends told their friends and this kind of thing. And anyway, the most recent incarnation of that studio, which I sold in 2017 before moving to Quebec, it was in Toronto. Um, there was a Uh, so the studio was up here. There was a stairs, and there was like a door, and the door went to the cold Toronto winter. And then there's 3 steps down, and there's a kitchen, and the kitchen is like right very close to the front door. But on snowy, mucky, slushy Toronto days, slush comes into the door, and the door doesn't shut, so it stays
Okay.
open a crack. People always coming and going. And but in the kitchen, it's a little bit lower than that, and there is no door on the kitchen. It's just open to the hallway. And I also would like put on the cup, the kettle to like make tea. I would go back up. I would get into editing, and just being like the absent-minded professor, I would forget about the kettle boiling. And then maybe an hour later would be like, oh, yeah. And I'd run down to the kitchen. Of course, the kettle had boiled dry. And a number of times I would come down the stairs, and as I came down those little 3 steps, I would go into like this kind of a fog. And up here it was like pea soup fog, and down here it was clear air. It was just the right conditions to form this layer of fog, kind of that would be at like chest height. So your head is in this really thick fog, and the rest of your body is like in clear air. And so that was one thing, but the thing that was amazing is that when you go in there, and if you stand still for a minute, not even for 10 seconds, the heat from your body rises up into the cold kitchen, and it starts to convect in this kind of a mushroom shape, like you get with an atomic bomb, basically.
Uh,
And that sucks the dry, clean air up and makes a void that just follows you. And then if someone else comes down and they make their own like little thing, and then you can come close together, and all of a sudden the fog clears between you, and you can talk to each other. And it's like as an art installation, this thing would be like the most golden, amazing palpably perceptible way of showing like the reaction between, you know, your human body, that you can bring people together and all of a sudden your two bubbles become one big bubble, and that's the one big bubble of your togetherness. And like the number of amazing metaphors that
Yeah.
occurred to me and my various clients, they would come to the studio as we would stand in this s- space with these kind of mushroom clouds like of clarity around us, right? If that could be recreated anywhere else, in a transportable way, oh my God, that would be like the best installation art anyone could ever imagine.
I was gonna ask you if you've tried to recreate it.
Yeah, I have tried to recreate it.
No luck?
You know, the kettle in a meat locker kind of experiments. Um, and no, it just, you know what? I think it can only happen in that one place, and you know, the building has since, you know, been passed on and made into some kind of a organic food co-op or something. I haven't been there for a few years, but anyway, and you know, it's the sort of thing that in from my perspective, like, though, that would be amazing. And yet, I don't think it would take so many possible variables to recreate that, and I don't even know what they are. Might be
Yeah.
some hidden ones, you know. So it's a very
That's the,
long-winded explanation.
no, that's good. That's the beauty of life is that a lot of these things that we experience and see are so fleeting and so
Exactly.
spectacular or even phantasmical like this, and,
Hmm.
it's important to appreciate them because you don't know if it's gonna be something that you'll see again or that if you can even recreate down the road. You might be the only person that's ever seen
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I had one guy came in. He was a clarinet player, and there was a day when the kitchen went foggy, and you know, I took him down. We reboiled the kettle and had tea, like, and he was like, "Dude, man, this is like without a doubt the coolest thing I've ever experienced." And, yeah, and for me too, it's just like gobsmackingly beautiful and full of beautiful metaphors, and it's
Yeah.
interactive. And oh my God, I want to go to like maybe I could convince them at the local metro here in Quebec with, you know, to like use the beer room on Sunday nights or something.
For testing purposes.
Yeah,
You
I
bring up a
promise not to touch the beer.
yeah, promise. You bring up a good question, and it's you wear so many different hats, and obviously you are a sum of all of them: musician, inventor, artist, entrepreneur.
Not
Is there
entrepreneur.
i- is there well, whatever, there's definitely that in there too. Um, is there one that you identify with the most, or do you always think it's a balance?
I think artist is probably the one that encapsulates most of the things that I do, and you know, maybe after that designer, but I think for me the difference between artist and designer, it's a blurry. There's a lot of discussion in the world between art and design, but for me, uh, a designer um, already knows kind of what they want to get, and they're using the world of possibility to come to some kind of an instrumental end, and the design fulfills some kind of goal. Um, Whereas from an artist, although there are elements of design in art, um, for me, often I don't know precisely what the end of the process is, except that I'm interested in the surprises that happen. Um,
Mhm.
and then once, you know, like let's say for example, with the thing I was just talking about, the mist machine or whatever we would call it, if I had managed to reproduce it, then I would put on my design hat and design a space that could reproduce all of the things that would be necessary. Um, so you know, there's art. Maybe you don't know what it is, and you're just following the materials. And you know, painters talk about it all the time. You know how the how the paint, it sits on the canvas in a color and a density and a texture that only happens at the moment that you put it on, and you can
Yeah.
have an educated guess about how it will work because you may have worked with these kind of acrylics from this brand, before, and or but maybe on this painting the humidity is a little bit different, so the paint cakes up a little bit, so that it's a little bit more rough, which means that there's all these little roughnesses, in the paint, and so when you add another paint on top of that, it doesn't combine in the same way, and then so all of a sudden you're in a new world of expression that you know, is exciting, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
you've got this multi-dimensional complexity that's following you on all fronts, and it really is not like the world of modernity where everything is kind of defined in mathematical boxes. Um,
Mhm.
it's this palpable materiality that you can smell it, and and you can feel it, and you can feel the grain of the canvas and the paint, and all of these things are helping to change the way that you move forward with that particular painting, right? And
Yeah.
and it's kind of the
When
same in woodworking, and also in terms of the types of outcomes that even machines that I built, which are pretty delimited with respect to how many things they can do, still often surprise me in the ways that they manifest as behaviors that are off label, right? And I
yeah,
realized that they're not off label. I just had the wrong label for them, and this other label's a better label.
when you going back to your youth, you had this desire to figure things out, and then from there it led to creating new things or trying new things. When you work on your artwork now, is it about discoverability, or is it about like that compulsion to get something out when you create the art? How does your art manifest?
Well, I think it often manifests just by some kind of a serendipitous inkling. There's something interesting there, and I do a lot of what I would call open research, um, which is always kind of happening as I'm working, and sometimes I discover a behavior which is like, okay, and and like I tend to really focus on the thing that I'm focused on, and so I have to write that down. If I don't
Mhm.
write it down, next week I'm going to be thinking, what was that thing that I saw last week? I can't remember. And often I talk with my wife all the time, and often I'll ask her, what was that thing that I was talking about last week? And she go, um, oh, it was, and say, oh, thank God, I'm glad you remembered, right? Because she's got a very clear memory for many things, and me, I tend to get so focused on the thing that I'm doing that I
Mhm.
forget, you know, about everything. I kind of have these perceptual blinkers on myself. Um,
You mentioned the
so
tea kettle. You mentioned the tea kettle, forgetting it there for an hour. That's because you're in the flow and you're so down into the flow that you forget the outside world.
yeah, and I think that there's a kind of a it might, and this is coming from discussions that I'm having with my wife, who's currently doing her PhD in political theory and philosophy, but that there's a kind of a real freedom um to not have to engage in things that where the future as you see it in idealized in like the goal to be achieved through it is that whatever it is you're doing as a motivation,
Yeah.
if the future doesn't dominate the present, um, with some kind of an idealized outcome, or in the pursuit of a specific widget that will achieve this so that it could be marketable for that, or in the writing of a song that sounds like the song over here that just sold because the A&R guy said, "Can you write a song that sounds like this? It
Mhm.
sounds like your voice to me," right? I'll like like pursuing something um that is open um is a kind of a freedom because the flow, and in sports we call it flow state, but I don't
Yeah.
think it's quite like that. I think that they're probably the same thing, but I think from an artist's perspective it's more an engaging in these polydimensional reality that is the best of yourself as an artist.
Mm,
Um, and I think as an artist, you got to be feel very secure in yourself to not like hit yourself over the head if the thing that you're chasing doesn't manifest as the thing that you thought it would be.
yeah.
Uh, and I think it's also important to feel secure in yourself to like take the time um, to allow that to happen, despite all kinds of pressures which constantly come from the world, saying, "Well, you know, shouldn't you do something more logical or something more practical?" Um,
Yeah, but you can't explain
shouldn't
that
you?
away.
Yeah, shouldn't you? You know, be working for your retirement. This sort of thing. And I've always been a little bit flippant about that. It might come back to kick me in the ass, but uh, I've been telling people since I was 20, when I get those kind of practical Canadian-like questions, that are always, about setting your life in a specific predictable path so that you won't have to
Mhm.
be hurting later. I mean, the hurting might be coming, but um, that that I would say, but I'm doing now what I would have been doing after I'm retired.
That's nice.
Because if I was retired, this is what I would be doing. Um, Except that I'm 22 or 23, or even now, I'm 64, right?
Yeah.
Uh, and I'm still, actually, I'd say I'm, I have more energy and more skills, and I'm doing more now than I ever have before. Because it's a head of steam that builds up. It's
Mhm.
like, as long as my health doesn't fail me, I'm just gonna keep at it.
Yeah. I mean, you sound like you followed your desire, your path, your heart for your entire life. And building on that last question, one of the things that I find very interesting is that you do commissioned work. Not because commissioned work is fascinating by itself, but like the idea of you being a man who has an idea and then knows when something's done because it feels like it versus someone else saying, "We need this project." Is there a big difference between the two? Like, how do you feel about having to complete something for someone else versus yourself?
Well, I don't I don't think I've ever done commission work, specifically in the way I think, and maybe we think about it as differently. But I do a lot of collaborative work. Um, so where I will collaborate with that. In fact, I really like to work with other artists. Um, but for the most part, what I'm interested in doing is bringing my skills to some kind of a sociality with other artists who have their skills, and we put it all together
Mhm.
into like a greater kind of an amalgam of possibilities. And then of course there's also the combined energy of multiple people too, right? Which allows more to be done, and hopefully there's not friction or too much argument, because then that slows the process down. So
Yeah.
it's almost like if there's kind of an agreement on what type of thing needs to be achieved in collaboration with other artists, then yeah, I'm totally happy to do that. Um,
So maybe I was mistaken, but in my notes I had that you had done commissioned work and that it was specifically like the Flux series, that there was something around that was commissioned.
no, that was my own. There were some early experiments with my friend John Zosky, and we've and I was just out of university, and I studied with this very famous composition teacher named James Tenney, um, renowned, brilliant guy who was like he lived in New York through the '60s. He knew everybody, and he really had like a wealth of experience, encyclopedic mind,
Mm.
photographic memory, just everything is just boom right there, really fantastic. And yeah, I used to like go to his house every Sunday because he had a salon, and then he was like, "Okay, so Garnet, what are you doing?" And I'd be like, "Well, I've got this problem, it's like just trying to crack this thing." And so John and I were trying to figure out how to build kind of a crazy spectral reverb, but make it physical rather than a DSP based one. It would have been 1992. And, there were digital reverbs, in boxes, and there was the beginning of digital audio workstation based plugins, these sorts of things. But anyway, Tenny, with his encyclopedic knowledge, he goes, you know, you should you should check out music on a long thin wire, because I think that it's a reversal of your approach, and I think you should just look at that. And so um, looked at that and realized that by reversing the relationship by which we were trying to motivate a string into motion, uh, there could be a possibility. And so John and I tried it, and boom, it worked a treat. And so that kind of it resulted in the production of a whole bunch of early experimental prototypes, and for me, I had this idea way back in the 1980s of doing something like a software-based string modeler algorithm that had
Mhm.
certain um, predilections for certain sets of harmonics, uh, and then changing the fundamental of that, and then feeding that back into another string modeler, and then when they cross at any particular frequency points where the harmonics line up, that will cause a resonance where they feed back into each other. But at that point in time, where a Mac 2FX with an accelerator board on it couldn't even do one good, string modeler, the idea, and there was no Max MSP. There was very few um, uh, systems that you could do the types of software processing, especially of digital audio,
Mhm.
that we have now. It's like consumer household goods now almost. Um, so the idea was to try and figure out how to make a piece that where the physicality of the work is doing what the idea of a virtual version of it would have done, except that there wasn't the computing power to do that. And in fact, recently I showed one of these pieces. I've got the original granddaddy of the whole thing here in my basement. Um, I could send you a recording I made last week of it if you want, and you could put it up
Sure.
on your thing. Um, and I was a friend of mine, um, who's one of the artists from Granular Synthesis, who I did programming for back in the 1990s, famous kind of art duo. Um, Kurt, he saw the harp, and he's a very smart guy, and he says, Garnet, you could make a DSP version of this. And it's like the loop was closed. She's like, I know I could, but I've got this, and this thing's full of surprises that I would have to tweak the DSP to give it the kind of natural permutations and mutabilities that would allow it to do what just humidity and air currents do with this
Yeah.
real one, right? And he had to grant that, yes, you'd have to tweak parameters to get it to do the things that this one does without, you don't even know why it does it, right?
Yeah. It's my mind is blown with just how much, there is to know, and even just how you're taking these things and combining them together. What's one of the, moments in your career so far as an artist where you said, "I can't believe I figured that out." That was
Oh man, there's so many. It's like I call them jump out of the chair moments. Uh, that's where I might be working on something. It's like, yes, uh, it's possible. And so I mean, there are certainly a few of them. Um, and I would say the first moment with John Zosky, when a string started to sound under an electromagnetically skewed fluctuating field, um, was like, oh my God, this is like, and it basically gave birth to a family of instruments, the first of which
mm,
John built, which was kind of that same strange sort of a spectral reverb. Um, and then from then I was like the idea of like, okay, if I take some of these strings and feed them back into the others, I'm going to be able to reproduce this digital model thing. And I didn't realize at the time that that the set behavior of 48 strings all sounding at the same time, uh, feeding into each other,
Mhm.
would create a kind of chaos. I mean, it is literally generative chaos that produces music in real time in front of you that you can't predict, right? Uh, there's all kinds of things which are just wonderful about that, because it's the same kind of generative chaos that's it's at the it's at the root of everything.
Mhm.
Like if we think about what a material is, let's think about, let's say, a mineral, or some kind of the first time an element comes into being. Um, uh, it's like there's some kind of crazy mixology happening, which is probably chaos, because chaos seems to
Yeah.
be under most processes. And all of a sudden, things just kind of snap together, and it's like, oh, that's a new thing in the universe, right?
Mhm.
And it's kind of like the creativity that happens all around us. And I remember talking with James Tenney about this, and he said, "Yeah, it's got like a peaceness to it." I go, "Peaceness?" And he goes, "Yeah." So, like a piece. What would you think a piece would be, right? And I say, "Well, it's a piece of music, right?" And he goes, "But a piece has got some kind of an aspect to it which draws it together, and further than it starting and stopping and there being silence on either side,
Yeah.
it probably has some kind of morphological and harmonic and density aspects to it, which which make it sound like itself and not other pieces, and it should have some kind of a coherency, maybe not necessarily how, uh, but it's got something we can say, this piece differentiates itself from all these other pieces, and we've got a label for it, which is, we'll call it Bob, right? So Bob sounds like this, Bob looks like this, Bob, happens to have a specific spot at it, at its climax, and then Bob just kind of, you know, has an ending. Maybe the ending is the boom, like in Beethoven or
Yeah.
something. Maybe add a couple more on just for effect. But the peaceness of it is the important thing. And when you start to get into these kind of natural generative systems, uh, it's good to define what peaceness is using nature as a metaphor. And so his explanation, which I use it all the time, um, is peaceness is like oakness, right? So let's say, for example, like out here, um,
Yeah.
I live in this beautiful forest with a lake, and it's got big windows that I can look out all the time to like
Yeah.
see this beautiful nature. But many of the trees here are oak trees, just by chance. And so he said, so let's say an oak tree, it's got a certain genetic predisposition to become an oak tree. It's got a certain texture of bark. It lives in these kind of areas. It likes this kind of soil. It grows into this kind of shape. Oak leaves always look like oak leaves, right? But each oak tree is a completely separate oak tree, and the things that make each individual oak tree are completely serendipitous. You
Mhm.
know, I so, like, when I was a kid, we went down to the St. Lawrence. We used to go down and watch the boats going through the canal. There's these locks on the St. Lawrence Seaway, and I
Yeah.
I just get so excited with these huge ships going by. It just floored my brain. Anyway, one time we were at one of these locks, and we we found a little beautiful little oak tree, and dug it up and planted it in the front yard of the family home in Ottawa, and it started growing, and it grew to about 6 feet tall. But then a mouse somehow got in and like chewed half the bark off, and then the tree kind of went, "Ah," right, and
Mhm.
then it healed over the spot where the mouse had cleared and continued to grow. But that mouse altered the future of the tree by having a snack one day, right?
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
and so there are all these variables. There's tendencies
Mhm.
towards being an oak tree, but there's all these variables that produce the individual iteration, if we will, of what an oak tree is. And so I became very interested in the idea, okay, so within a system that has its own generative potentials, what sorts of things um, will give today's momentary iteration of the piece a different set of flavors to tomorrow's, to the next day? Because these things, this piece, the cluster flux, which I have here, I can leave it running like day in and day out.
Yeah.
First time I put it in a gallery, it ran for 6 weeks nonstop. And, you know, I let it run all night and all day, and the gallery staff are going crazy because it's a living, kind of almost like a living, breathing system, and it doesn't always behave in an aesthetically pleasing way, right? It's
Yeah.
designed to be unpredictable. And
It's
sometimes,
funny. I was gonna bring it up because the name itself is so telling of this whole ideology, right? Cluster flux. It's a hilarious play on the word, and that is this. We are living in oh my goodness, what is the word, Chris? Controlled chaos in some ways.
Yeah, it's like a quadruple play on word. There's the clusters of the dense chords that it makes. There's
Yeah,
the magnetic flux density that's motivating the sound. Uh, uh, and there's the constant fluctuation of the myriad of layers of frequency information flowing through it. And then there's the play on words for clusterfuck. Like,
absolutely.
all
Well,
these things, right? Like,
I I have 2 questions for you. Why don't we go backwards a second? Because at the very beginning of our conversation, we were gonna dive into music, and I said, "How do you know Jay Lang? She's an amazing writer, an amazing human, and ultimately the person that put us in touch."
Mhm,
And I know that you grew up, playing music, and you were even in Tokyo Rose, I believe, for
mhm.
several years. So
Yeah.
how do you know Jay? And tell me a little bit about your music.
Um, so, uh, so you want the long story or the short story?
Do you have short stories?
No, no. And as a joke, uh, the people who I've been most recently working with to make this pendulum and organ piece, before I start telling them something, I have to tell them how long it's going to be. So, hey, you know something? I go 2 minutes, and they go, okay.
That's funny. Okay, 2 minutes.
uh, uh, so, uh, in high school, my first of all, my dad came home with a synthesizer. It was a
Yep.
little monophonic Yamaha synthesizer. It made pretty crappy sounds, but by the standard of like the mid 1970s, it was pretty amazing for me. And it didn't really have a lot of the standard control that you could apply to an analog synthesizer that you might have later on, let's say a few years later. Um, but to me, combined with the home organ and the piano, uh, all of a sudden I had the possibility of playing music. And so joined a couple of bands that were high school basement bands and put on some concerts, and slowly kind of accumulated some better gear. And I can remember playing the Six Wives of King Henry VIII in front of my high school. Uh, I didn't have a cape, but I wanted one. um, and I had just bought this little Micro Moog synthesizer. It cost everything I could afford, and but I could do that kind of like doodly doodly Rick Wakeman showmanship.
Mhm.
And um, anyway, uh, upon leaving high school, joined this band Tokyo Rose, and but even at high school, I knew Lance Chalmers, who he was playing drums in some high school bands that I don't know if I joined them, but I might have jammed with them a little bit. And then later on, this band was formed, and we were doing local bar scene. We were doing um yeah, we're really at the heart of the combination of the band. It was a prog rock band
Yeah.
with a lot of arguing amongst ourselves about the direction that our songwriting should go. Um, there was some of us wanted to just pursue what came of the collective moment of like working a song together, and other elements in the band wanted to, I would say, mature, right? And that's an industry term, um, uh, to produce something that could be vaguely seen as marketable. And I think that basically we succumbed to the mature side, and that's about the time I lost interest. Um,
Mm,
um, and when I look at the music that we were writing now, I realize if we just held the line and continued to push for the thing that came naturally as a bunch of young players who had the ability to play and the talent to like you know bring all kinds of colors and densities and stuff
mhm.
together, that it might have been better than if we started to chase uh specific utilitarian ends in our songwriting. um and But anyway, so yeah, so Lance was in Tokyo Rose for a while, and continued long after I had departed. I was increasingly getting interested in the idea of building some electronics that I saw as, because back in the 1980s, there was almost nothing for like a small budget keyboard player, right? There was
Yeah.
huge expensive mixing boards and expensive, multi-track analog tape machines in recording studios. Uh, there were a couple of small mixing things. I think Tapco had one, and I think Soundcraft was coming out with some smaller boards and these sorts of things. But I really wanted to build some stuff, and managed to talk a friend of a friend into building me a mixing board to like mix all my keyboards together, because I had this kind of keyboard pit, right? I wish I
Yeah.
had those keyboards now. It'd probably be some of them collectible. Um,
So it
but
sounds like that you had, artistry growing up, music around you, then you got into you taking things apart, building things, music happened. Music was too uh it was not clusterfluxy enough for you. It was too systemic, and then you decided to go more into the creative side on your own.
yeah, I kind of was interested in building certain things that I didn't have the skills to build.
Mhm.
And the guy who had built this mixer for me, he goes, "Well, you should just go to Algonquin College and take the course that I took, and then you can make your own stuff and not have to get me to do it for you." Uh, and I got to admit, I did lean on him hard, and he did a lot of work for me just out of the love of the work, right? And
Yeah.
and so I kind of wanted to move forward, and it was the early days of MIDI, and there was almost nothing, maybe an Atari 1040 computer, and as of 1990, 84. I
Yeah.
think maybe not even that early. It's all kind of a blur. Um, but I wanted to build some stuff. So, for example, I built a probably the world's first MIDI digitally patchable MIDI patch bay. That was one of the first things. I just remember that specifically, but it had like 16 keyboards it could feed, modules or whatever, and
Mhm.
4 controllers. And on each module, you could just pick which controller or combination of controllers you wanted, and then the MIDI would just be routed, and you don't have to go and constantly plug in and unplug MIDI cords, right? Which is
Yeah.
what the way it was. And of course, all of that's now beautifully integrated inside digital audio workstations. But back then, is you plug it in or it doesn't work. And
Yeah.
um, so I
So
think there was kind of an organic move from music over to wanting to do music technology. But there's a secondary thing, is that right at the end of my studies in electronics, I I worked at a couple places. I worked at IBM, and then I worked at Bell Northern Research, which was basically the Bell Labs of Canada. And that's because I had heard that is like that is like that's the job you want. Like, this is like, it's
mhm.
research. It's amazing. They're doing all this aerospace stuff, and they're the cutting edge of telecommunications technology, and it's research. So there's a lot of openness there. And I went and I worked there, and it was actually a very amazing place to work. But what I saw is that guys like me were like, by the time they're 35, are middle level managers,
Mhm.
and and uh, I just didn't see that as being the thing that I wanted to become.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, well, it would be great to have this job within safe bounds that, has a lifetime of pretty interesting work. Um, but maybe what I might want to do is go back to the arts in some way. So I decided that's it. I'm going to do a degree in music, and I had heard that this fellow James Tenney was teaching at York University in Toronto. So I applied, and I learned some classical pieces specifically to do the audition, and
Mhm.
auditioned and got in, and then once there, discovered all kinds of things I had been previously unaware of, like electroacoustic music and all this kind of really noisy uh, tape music from the '60s, and it kind of blew my mind that was actually a thing.
Yeah.
That
Well, so you kind of have perfectly set up, my last question in the sense that you've followed your path, you've kind of marched to the beat of your own drum for your entire life and for your career, and you are now, heavily awarded, you've traveled around, your work's been shown in so many different, countries globally. What is the main thing that you would attribute your tenacity to, or what drives you in the morning when you wake up, and how have you got here from there?
um, well, I would say that most days are kind of a one day at a time thing. And most people use that to describe their recovery from an illness, or some kind of a crisis in their life, or they had a divorce, or like a something that has um the crisis of the situation has caused them to emerge into a consciousness of their life which is uh, dealing with the specific challenges of the moment. And I think for me, the thing that I like to do in the morning is to wake up to a kind of a challenge, like what is it today I'm gonna do? And sometimes it's, I have to find some way to do something remunerative. Like I do industrial design. Some people, ask me to design something. You could call that a commission, but I don't call it a commissioned artwork. It's a commissioned design. Maybe that's what you're on about when
There
you
you
asked
go.
earlier. Um, uh, and other days it might be some kind of a project here at the house. I've got this house which is, I'm slowly, by hook, crook, or by hook, either fixing things or adding new things, or customizing the house in a way that will, leave my mark on it. Um, Other days it would be, going out of the wood shop and playing around with some kind of a resonance on a material. A lot of days it's emails to people saying, this is a possibility. Would you be interested in working on this? Uh, Other days it would be like, okay, I'd like to work on this, but my take would be this rather than this because this is where my skills lie. Um,
Mhm.
so there's a whole bunch of dynamics within which the day can be made exciting, and then there's other days where I have to go to the wood shop and um, sand all day, because there's something that I've made, like, the last few days that needs sanding, and sanding sanding is like penance, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like I think almost any particular endeavor that you can come across has got its penance-like aspects. So, for example, writing music, if it's, if you score it, like actually copying the score, that's like sanding. It's like the kind of the last thing you do. Well, maybe varnishing is the last thing you do in woodworking, which I also find, un- fist-eatingly boring, as my wife would
Yeah.
say. Um, and I don't have a lot of patience for it. I have friends who are, painters and decorators that, pay the bills doing that because they're artists as well. And they've got this kind of infinite patience with the materials, and they can paint so quickly because it's like a flow and an energy, and everything's just it's like boom, the paint goes on and it's like perfect, right? And you
Well,
know,
so you like more of the chaos in the controlled chaos than the control, and that's okay too.
I like the challenge. And so like I like to always push myself, and of course the pushing myself also creates a stress. And
Mm.
and sometimes I definitely burn myself out a little bit because I'm working so hard on a specific project, usually under a deadline, to prepare for an exhibit. Um,
Mhm.
and of course, the way that I work does have a lot of possibility to fray into all kinds of, sparking, dangling wires and sort of chaotic possibilities that
Yeah.
I might want to follow. But then the time, the deadline is coming towards me, and I have to make the choice. Well, okay, it might be time to abandon this one and just, call it what it is. Um, uh, and so in those moments, I do tend to get a kind of a physical exhaustion in, and I think that that's kind of because I invite that by not relenting on the challenges. Uh,
Yeah.
but so we uh, exhibited a couple pieces this past fall, one for the first time and one for multitude of times. But still, there's always things that need to be done between exhibits, and so having two pieces coming up for exhibition at the same time was kind of hectic for me. And so I guess like October, I guess from November and December, I've been kind of being a little more chill, just so I can as I said to Becky, it's my wife back in November. I said, I think I lost my mojo.
Well,
In
you
terms of having the energy to engage with a project.
yeah.
But it's coming back here. So, I I've got this I've got a really uh let's just say ambitious thing I'm building for my house. And I don't know if it's going to work yet, but I think by about next Monday, I'll know if the whole thing's for naught or if it's going to work. And my educated guess on it that it's going to work, but you know, I don't want to play it safe, right?
That doesn't
and
sound
but
like you.
I don't want to build a prototype and then have it work, right? If I'm going to build a prototype, I want the prototype to fail, because that way I say, good thing I built the prototype. But if the prototype works, it's like, what did I do that for?
That's funny. Garnet, you are definitely as advertised, and everything that you've discussed somehow is exactly what your environment is like. There you're in the middle of the woods, and there's calm, and there's a system, and there's white walls, but then you have the chaos of a Hawaiian shirt that seems out of place in all of that. You bring to mind Jeff Goldblum's character in Jurassic Park, because he talks a lot about chaos theory, and then says life finds a way. That seems to be how you are with your art.
I say it's probably true. And I'd say that in that, I think I'm just always looking for a surprise. Like, surprise me. Uh, and, uh, and, then if I can like encapsulate that surprise in an artwork,
Mm,
then it's like other people will like have the surprise, right?
yeah.
And that's a kind of engagement that you don't necessarily always get in the art world, because the art world tends to reveal itself in your observational interactions,
Mhm.
uh, for the most part, without the artwork contributing its own personality into the thing, in terms of its in a time-based way. It's like, hey, it
Yeah.
just turned into something else in front of me, right? Uh, you know, like a lot of sculptures, they're static, except that when you move around them, they're not static. Um,
Mhm.
but I'm very interested in his works that I can't tell how they're gonna look in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
I really appreciate your time and letting me into your mind and into your world. Why don't you surprise me? I always like to end with the final word from you. So give me something that the readers, or sorry, the listeners and watchers, the viewers should take away as an important lesson to get where you've been, to get to
mm,
follow your journey.
gee, that's you put me on the spot here. I think it's, you have to sort of trust in the outcomes of something. And,
Mm,
I or here's another one. Let's say, for example, you're doing something and you do a lot of it and you do a good job. I have a little adage that I say to myself, which is that whatever you do, the universe will have you do more of that if you're doing it for the right reasons, right? So my perspective on it, well, if that's the case, and I've kind of observed that this is the case, uh, that it's best to do something that you enjoy and that sort of brings the best of yourself into the world, so that then when the universe makes you do more of that, then you can do more of what you enjoy. And I think that that might be a good adage for, the tome of history.